Welcome to Mostly Minutia. I'm Colleen Lindell, and this is episode 44, Scott Marvel. A few days ago, I read a quote by the late artist Ben Shahn. He said, "I believe that if it were left to artists to choose their own labels, most would choose none." And when I read this quote, it reminded me of my guest, Scott Marvel. Scott is an artist, he's a husband, a father, he's a filmmaker. He's the president of Daily Planet, a production company based in Chicago with a huge heart and focus on humanitarian projects. And he's also the founder of Give a Shirt, a nonprofit organization that helps the homeless to get back on their feet. Scott is also a renowned putterer. He has a fascination with the mundane and the seemingly trivial. And in today's story, he holds nothing back in exploring the trivial, or how the trivial may not seem so trivial at all. Today's story is really a grandfather-grandson story, although quite naturally it overflows into a father-son story. And in this episode, Scott shares with us the story of his Grandpa Rudy's death when Scott was just 6 years old, and how that one event has shaped his life. In this episode, we are going to talk about death. We're going to talk about anxiety. We're going to talk about growing up in the Lutheran Church. We're going to talk about how our formative years sometimes shape our worldview, and how sometimes when you're a son, you don't quite understand your dad. There are going to be some tangents, but mostly I think they all flow nicely into Scott's story. A few notes. At some point, Scott and I talk about Michael. Michael happens to be my wonderful boyfriend who works with Scott, and without whom I wouldn't have met Scott. So, thank you, Michael. Secondly, Scott has 3 older sisters, Penny, Pam, and Susan. Also, Scott is 6'5", but when standing next to him, he has this amazing ability to feel the same height as you. And that is how disarming this man is. Lastly, I mentioned before that Scott is a filmmaker. He has specifically animated a film telling the story of his grandpa's death through little characters that look like little beans, which Scott lovingly refers to as bean people. Okay, that should suffice. Here is Scott.
I grew up in Dundee, Illinois, a small town outside of Chicago, kind of like Mayberry. Tiny, there's a main street with stores, a drugstore, a post office. Walkable, everything was walkable. I have 3 older sisters and then me. When I was born, my parents lived with my grandparents. So I grew up with my grandparents. Every day, grandparents. And my dad, because having more kids, took a new, same company, but a new position at the company where he was traveling more, so he was gone all the time. And so I spent a lot of time with my grandpa, who, for whatever reason, I don't know the full story, lived in the basement of our house. My grandma lived upstairs. Not sure why. I had heard that it was an arranged marriage, that her parents kind of forced them to get married, they didn't get along. My grandpa, for whatever reason, also had these things where I'll say it the way I was told. I don't know what it was medically, but his legs would bleed. So the story I got was that my grandma didn't want him to bleed on the furniture.
Upstairs.
Upstairs. Not upstairs, but even the middle floor, where we all hung out. But I would hang out with him all the time. And I was told much later that when I was born, he was diagnosed with an aneurysm in his heart, like not a brain aneurysm, but a heart aneurysm. But he was scared of doctors. So the doctor just said, just let him live out his days. And I would play with him all the time. The first thing I would do when I would get up was go down to the basement. We did puzzles together down there. He smoked a pipe. I'd help him pack his pipe, or he put apples in his tobacco pouch to keep the tobacco moist. I would help him with that. But then on October 29th, my sister Penny and I, the eldest sister, were carving a pumpkin at the top of the basement steps. And we heard him make a sound. And my grandma and mom were in the kitchen. We said, I think grandpa made a sound. And then we heard it again. It was like a grunt or something. It was a weird enough sound for us to say that it just happened again. My mom went downstairs and then came back up and told Penny, I think, to put me in the living room. Called my dad, who was a part-time police officer. So he comes with the police, and then my grandpa died. The ambulance went away, my grandpa died. Like the next day I was told. I came downstairs and I said, where is he? What happened? They said, he's gone. And I couldn't process, like, wait, he's gone, when's he coming back?
Yeah.
I'm going to jump around here a bit, but then he had a twin brother, identical twin brother, who lived 5 houses down from us on the same street. But it was weird because it's like he was still there, but it wasn't the same person. My sister Penny saw my Uncle Dick in the house and thought that it was a ghost of Rudy, my grandpa.
Oh, how strange.
So she was old enough to kind of be freaked out by that. And then that kind of haunted me for a long time. And I was scared of going down to the basement. Mm-hmm. And my dad, who was, he was a military guy. He was a kind of a screw up in school, never graduated from high school, was kicked out. And then his dad sent him to the army, which a lot of people did back then, like to straighten out his life. Mm-hmm. Then he came back and was kind of the model citizen. Just worked his way up from nothing. And was kind of that sort of guy, like a tough guy, like you work your way through anything. So he would take me down in the basement and say, why are you scared of the basement? I said, there's ghosts. What do you mean? And he'd take me down there and say, okay, show me the ghosts. Show me the ghosts. And I couldn't, of course. What I found out much later, like when I was 18, was that I had snuck down to the basement and saw them trying to revive my grandpa, saw my dad trying to revive my grandpa and say, he's not coming back, he's not coming back. I had always told the story that they brought him up through the house, and I saw them in the dining room doing that. Mm-hmm. My mom heard me telling that story and said, they didn't, the side door to the house is right up from the basement. Why would they take him up through the kitchen, through the dining room, not the front door? They'd go through the side door. I said, no, but I can show you it happened right here. I could almost chalk mark it. Mm-hmm. She said, no, it didn't. I said, I saw it. She said, yeah, you saw it because you didn't listen and you snuck down and you saw it. It was a big puzzle solved, for me, as to possibly why I was terrified. Mm-hmm. And I think like early loss just freaks you out as a kid, not knowing any of that and not really having a family that would talk about that in those terms ever. You just have to kind of figure that out on your own.
I also feel like, death to the older people, death is confusing as an adult, but it still is like we've accepted it. Like, yeah, people die. Mm-hmm. Okay. But to a young person, it's so confusing. And to not have anybody step in and to understand that about a young person and try to explain it to them or try to understand. Yeah.
And it was kind of my only friend, like at the time. So I lost like the person I hung out with every day. Mm-hmm. So I didn't just lose a family member. It wasn't like Grandpa lived in another house. Mm-hmm. And it's like, oh, we have sad news, Grandpa died. And it's like, oh, I lost that person that I see twice a year at Thanksgiving and Christmas. This was someone I saw every day. I didn't have friends my own age. Mm-hmm. And he was kind of pushed to the side because no one really had time for him. My grandma clearly didn't want him sleeping in bed with her.
Not with his bleeding legs.
Not with those bleeding legs. You won't get in this bed with those bleeding legs. My mom loved him, but like he had all the time in the world. He didn't have a job. Mm-hmm. He just wanted to putter around. And I had all the time in the world to putter around too. Mm-hmm. So we were made for each other. But as a kid, you just like spaces. You play house. So he had like a little setup. He had made, it was almost like a fort. Like it was an unfinished basement. But he had made, he had a little card table for puzzles. He had a couch with a pillow where you sit or he sleeps. He had a radio. It was very minimal. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of like his own little room that he had made. Mm-hmm. And everything in there had a purpose. So I just remember exploring that. He had a book of poetry that he'd read. He'd listen to German radio. He was German.
Why do you think he was so afraid of the doctor?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't like doctors either. I don't know. I don't know if he was afraid of surgery or the doctor or both.
Why don't you like doctors?
I don't like tests and I don't like death, obviously. Mm-hmm. I never flip it and think, oh, I'm going to the doctor to find this thing out so I can get better. I always think, what's wrong? I would love to be able to take it from another angle and just be an adult about it and go, oh, I should get this checked out. Or even if I don't consciously say it or assume it, there's always that thing in the back of your head that says, you're fucked.
You're right.
Like that one T-shirt I did. That's what that's about. Like you're sitting there watching The Voice and laughing at how funny Adam Levine and Blake Shelton are together. But there's some cancer growing inside you. And you feel that little thing once in a while there. But it's probably, 2 months you're dead. Mm-hmm. It's that.
Have you always had... I'm not trying to analyze you. I'm just trying to understand your thought process, I guess, a little bit around stuff like this. Because I've had this too, like sometimes really like hypochondriac types of thoughts, or like even I've noticed involuntary responses inside of myself, like when all of a sudden you become aware that you're breathing. And you're like, now I can't breathe normal. I'm controlling each one of my breaths, or like I remember one time I became aware that I swallowed food, and then all of a sudden I was not able to swallow. I mean, it was a real thing, Scott. Like my parents went through like nights and nights of me not being able to eat dinner because I was like, I can't swallow this, because I was so aware of my swallowing. Is that weird?
I experienced all those things. You just answered the question if someone asked you, what's Scott Marvel like if he smokes dope? That's exactly what happens to me. I would love to be Willie Nelson. I would love to be able to smoke every day and kind of walk around in a good mood and just function properly.
Yeah, be really
And the
productive.
reason they call it dope. I forget how to breathe. I forget how to swallow. Everything becomes a chore. If I'm walking, I'm fine. I figured that out. If I'm walking, I can just walk and be fine. Anytime I would stop, it would be like, wait, I'm breathing, right? It's brutal. But you're talking not smoking dope. As a kid, you had this problem.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's scary. Probably even scary for parents, maybe. I don't know how your parents were.
They were not handling it very well.
Yeah. Which means what?
Losing a lot of patience with me.
Yeah.
And telling me to just eat your food. Uh-huh. Here's a glass of milk. Swallow it. Uh-huh. And then I remember they handed me a bag of Cheetos, and all of a sudden I could swallow.
That's a great trick. That's a great trick.
Cured.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I've had, like, as an adult even, like every once in a while notice certain things, and it's like I'll fixate on that thing. Mm-hmm. Actually, I think now that I pray and have, meditation times, that's helped me to calm down a bit. But I've had like major anxieties in life.
Yeah,
I guess.
Same here. Not at first. I was a go-getter and I did stuff, and then it just crept in.
Like when were you a go-getter? When was that in your life?
Well, I have to go back on that actually, because I did faint in church once. And I fainted playing baseball once. I sat in for the catcher at practice, and it was a hot summer day. So that was heat related. And maybe the church thing was too. They didn't have good air conditioning. It was a Lutheran church. You're supposed to suffer. But I would also get nervous, and my dad would always make us sit in the first pew. Like the usher would come,
really?
And they knew, like, not the very first pew of the church, but in front of everyone else. Oh. So everyone's heads were staring at the back of our heads. And you're right up there, and you can't move. If you're in the back of the church, you can get out and no one knows. Uh-huh. So it was that thought of like, shit, if I have to go somewhere, everyone's going to see me go somewhere, and they're going to talk about it, and all eyes are on me. Mm-hmm. But it never wanted all eyes on me. Mm-hmm. And then if you go to enough therapy, you realize, oh, you wanted all eyes on you. Mm. If you were in charge of this, you'd be fine, and you could easily lead it. Like being on stage is something, and I think a lot of people freak out about being on stage, and then they're on stage and they do all right. Mm-hmm. Somehow they change that anxiety into energy, positive energy. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. My anxiety, though, I realized, even though it wasn't presenting itself in full form, I had little moments of it, of being nervous, and fainting always felt like death to me. Like someone dropping was so traumatic to me, but who cares? You drop, you get up, you're fine. Mm-hmm. But it felt like you're dying a little bit when you faint. Like you losing consciousness seemed awful to me. Mm-hmm. So when I fainted in church, that was a big deal, standing there. And it's a Lutheran service. And at the time, I mean, it was like there was a pastor that would do services in German, Pastor Cam Pfeffner. It was his
Cam
name.
Pfeffner?
Yeah, think about that. That's a name, right?
Yeah.
So he would go up. He'd go through a door that was concealed, like he'd just push it open. So this wall, little part of it would open up. You wouldn't see him, and then you'd see his head. He'd walking up here. He'd stand on a pulpit way above us. And when I was a kid, I thought, that he yelled at my parents for an hour, and then because it was so bad, once in a while they'd get cookies and Kool-Aid, like wine, like the communion. That was in my head. That was what was happening,
right?
Because it sounded like yelling. It didn't sound like this love or anything. Like, oh man, you got to be cool with each other. It was they were going to be told what they did wrong.
Okay.
For the week.
Okay.
We went every week, 8 o'clock service every week. When the service was over, he'd sing his benediction, and then we'd sing a hymn while he walked down the steps and through the door. And I remember thinking, before he finished his sermon, because it was such an impassioned performance,
right?
You clap. When there's something at school and someone sings a solo, we clap. So we clap. I'm sitting there for what must have been 20 minutes thinking, we clap. And I asked my dad, you're not supposed to talk in church.
Right.
So I'm trying to figure it out. And I didn't have the wherewithal at the time to think, I'll wait a beat. If everyone else claps, I'll join in. Like, that would have been the easy thing. So he finishes his service, and I go, and my dad looks down, and my sisters are giggling, and my mom's shaking her head, and I felt like an idiot. It was awful. It rang through the church. This big one little kid with the biggest, I went big, too. Like, I could have just gone, like, no one would have noticed. They would have thought I was slapping a fly or something, but I went like that. My dad, he had the eye. He could look at you from across a room, a crowded room. He could look at you and stop you with an eye look.
Oh, man.
I don't have the eye with my daughter. She doesn't even notice I'm there. He had the eye. Like, if you were doing something wrong and he looked, you would stop.
Well, I love that you made your sisters giggle, though.
Yeah.
Because that probably was so funny.
Yeah.
Thank God you did it. You broke the ice.
Yeah,
Seriously.
I guess. I felt awful.
I know.
Like, I felt like I'd crossed something that I wasn't supposed to cross. Mm-hmm. I was asked at the end of every service when we'd get home that day, my dad would change into his work clothes to do stuff around the house or read the paper. But I was asked, what was it about? You listened, right? What was the sermon about? Like, I had to dissect it for him.
Really?
And I was like, Sometimes I'd be able to tell him a little bit.
Why was he so...
He just wanted me to be, he wanted us all to be these great people, and why waste my time? If I'm going to take you there, you're going to listen. Mm-hmm. And you're going to repeat it back to me.
Oh, my gosh.
But I didn't get it. And I didn't get, then the falling out a little bit for me was kind of that Examination Sunday where I kind of saw behind the curtain a bit. Mm-hmm. So Examination Sunday, they want to make sure you went to school, you've learned all this stuff, you're able to be allowed back or allowed into the community, and you're making this choice. Mm-hmm. You're being asked, do you want to be a Lutheran in this church? And you say yes.
Okay.
But man, you're 13 years old. Mm-hmm. You don't know anything about love or loss, maybe. I mean, I had loss, but I didn't know about loss. You don't understand the world. I mean, I'm a slow learner. I'm still learning about this stuff. Mm-hmm. You read like James Joyce, and he wrote these great things when he was like 25, 23. It's like he knew a lot more about the world and human relationships than I still know. Mm-hmm. I wasn't that guy, and I have a feeling a lot of people weren't. Mm-hmm. So they give you questions. You go up in groups of 5, let's say.
Oh, wow.
And
okay.
they tell you, here's the 5 questions that this group's going to be asked, and here's the answers. So they ask you just to basically memorize the answers to these questions you're given. And then what's so hard about that? Then you memorize them and you say it, and then that tells everyone, oh, wow, he knows this stuff. Mm-hmm. He can be confirmed. So I saw behind the curtain a bit, and I also thought, this isn't really my choice. I can't tell my parents I don't want to do this.
Right.
Fuck the Missouri Senate. No, that's not going to happen. No one's going to say that. Not one of my friends is going to say that. No one's going to say, I don't want to be this. Because that would be worse than the clap at the end of the sermon. That would have almost worse. That would be awful. So it's not really my choice. Mm-hmm. So they're not really asking me if I'm choosing this. Mm-hmm. You're just going through the motions. And that started just to reverberate with me and kind of piss me off. Like, I'm not making this choice. Mm-hmm. Because it's all about becoming a man or becoming a person, becoming a woman.
Right.
And they're not really allowing you to do that.
Mm-hmm. So, Scott, something that I like about, I'm just going into, I guess, your films.
Yeah.
I so appreciate how you've created these films with like the exploration from a young person's view, or that's what it feels like to me.
Yeah.
And the one film that I'm specifically talking about is the one about your grandfather passing. You know, a theme that I see in all of your films is religion. This is like a thread that just keeps weaving itself through.
It's in every single one of them, I think, yeah.
How do you feel? Because it's like it seems like your life is like marked by that event, you know, of your grandfather passing, and then you consistently trying to like sift from that, and then sift from these other things in your childhood to figure out what the heck is actually happening, or like who am I, and like what's my identity. And I was wondering, I guess, how do you feel like these things have been defining you, I guess, or do you feel like they've been defining you? Like a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Because I don't know the exact questions, so I'm hoping if I ask a bunch of them, then you'll say whatever comes to you.
Right.
Yeah. What are your thoughts about all this stuff I just said?
Yeah. I'm teasing. I was going to do that to you right away. Yeah. Joaquin Phoenix you.
Does he do that?
He did that on Letterman once, like when he was playing a part for a film, and he came out and you'll look it up. It's funny.
Okay.
Yeah. It's funny because Letterman kind of gets pissed off at him, and he was totally playing a part for a movie that he was making with Casey Affleck, I think.
Oh, he's
called
just like,
I'm Not Here. But he literally just went, oh, yeah. And Letterman's like, whenever you want to show up. I can't remember what Letterman said, but he was getting irked.
Yeah.
So I was going to do that to you. That's the verb I use for that, Joaquin Phoenix you. About those films, I don't make them for money, and I don't make them for other people, though I want everyone to see them, you know?
Yeah.
So I make them, they are like, I put everything I know into those films. There's nothing in there that isn't real or isn't. I might mix some parts of things, like, oh, this didn't happen at this time, but it happened somewhere else, and I put it in here. But it's all sort of a calling card of everything that made an impression on me. I never look at it for the sale. I never look at it for the commerce of it or what would be popular. It's like, I have to say this. And religion was a huge part of my growing up. And hugely inspirational and disappointing to me, because at my grandfather's funeral, I remember sitting there as a young kid, open casket, and I remember listening to the pastor speak, not really hearing what he was saying, and just to the left of him was that famous painting of Jesus looking like a hippie, tan, with a white robe on, basked in sunlight, like sun rays, like Thomas Kincaid, like at a cabin door, knocking on it. And me thinking, if I ever look out the window and see him knocking at the door, I'm going to hit the floor and pretend no one's home, because he just took my grandpa. And they kind of personify that. This, the sayings go, well, he's with Jesus now. Jesus wanted him more, or whatever. People personify it from the perspective of someone about my age at that time, but it made no sense to me then. Like, screw that.
Yeah.
No one wanted him more. No one wanted him more. I guarantee you. So why does he get to go? He's at peace now. I get that part of it, like the bodily. The legs aren't bleeding anymore. That part is cool.
Yeah,
it might not have been cool at the time, but I get that. But even to this day, it's like, no, like that doesn't work for me. I don't care where they are. I want them here now.
Yeah. Have you ever seen like angels or anything like that?
No. The best I can say is I've not visually seen angels. I've heard voices from time to time, but not anything that was like revelatory. Not like, put $100 on red at the roulette table. Nothing that would help me. Nothing that I could really even understand.
Yeah.
But voices that were, I swear to God, were there.
Okay.
So almost insightful, like, oh, something else is out there, maybe. And also when my dad died, he died at my sister Pam's condo. And it was cloudy out, and as soon as he died, like it was a Spielberg film, the clouds parted and sun went onto his body.
No way.
And I also felt more than any other death I'd been present for, I felt like the energy had left the room. Because he was in a coma for a little bit of time, like an hour or two. When he actually died, it was like he was unzipped from the bottom, like under the bed, and something had escaped. And not physically, but just feeling-wise. He was such a large person in life, not physically, but it felt like something had left the room.
Wow.
Unbelievable. And I was just like in awe. And it was like, even though his body was there, he looked the same as he did when he was alive a second ago. He wasn't there. He was gone. I finally felt it. My whole life I was looking for that. You know, like what did gone mean? What does gone mean? And then the sun shined in. It was kind of beautiful, you know?
I was just about to ask you what's your evolution as an artist, but I really also want to ask you if you have any formal faith right now. Hard to pick.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Yeah. But they're connected, I think.
Hooray!
Yeah. That's one question.
Good job, intuition. Good job.
That's a good question. I don't have any formal faith right now. I'll say that's the easy answer, meaning I don't belong to a church or a group of people that have any faith. And there's so much I feel that's missing from the conversation between atheists and people that believe in God, that I feel like there's a middle group that I belong to. Like, you know, like Bill Maher's like a hardcore atheist to the point where he's more annoying than, or as annoying as a evangelical Christian at your door, because he's like, you're wrong, you can't believe this, there were no talking snakes. And it's like, to me it's like, wow, that's a great story, and if you miss the story you're missing a lot. So there's that. And then there's also like, I hold firm to the belief that, or the thought that, you're so impressionable as a kid that stuff never leaves you. And I took it seriously as a kid. So I like the thought of it all. What I didn't see in the church I was growing up in was love for the community and for fellow people. Like, I started to get the sense, like, why can't anyone take this body and blood? Would Jesus be cool with that? And I wasn't like this radical communist reader, thinker thing. I was young at the time, but thinking, wait, why are we dividing ourselves? Why? Because we were Lutheran. I didn't know what a Catholic was growing up. But there's a word in the Lord's Prayer, is it the Lord's Prayer, Nicene Creed, or whatever, one Catholic church or whatever?
Yeah.
And they changed it in our school to not be Catholic.
No
But
way?
it's a bigger word than just the religion of Catholicism.
Yeah.
And that seemed wrong to me. Like, they were so troubled by the thought that we would think we were saying Catholic in a Lutheran school. Like, who cares?
Right, yeah. It's like petty.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
as far as faith goes, I like the idea of it. I like the idea of love being the answer and treating people as well as as good as you can. And I do think that there's something after death. I don't think it ends here.
Yeah.
I like the idea of no anxiety. Shit, that would be great.
Yeah, I can't even imagine
Right.
living a life without anxiety.
And no suffering and no physical ailments.
Yeah.
And just feeling light and love, you know? So sometimes I have to go to other religions, and I don't delve deeply, but I bring them back to my Lutheran upbringing, and they all seem to say the same thing. There's different words, and there's an old Buddhist saying, like, don't mistake the moon for the fingers pointing at the moon. I don't know if you've ever heard that.
No.
But it means there's one source. I think this is what it means. This is what I take it to mean. There's one source, and there's several people pointing at the same source. And they have different ways of pointing at it. But that source can't be changed. That source can't be co-opted, even though people try. So you can make up rules and stuff, but that seems more the politics of religion, like all the rules of don't do this, don't do that. Why would anyone make someone? This is a mystery to me. Mm-hmm. If you're all power and you're making someone in your image, I get why you would make suffering. Mm-hmm. And I get why you would make me able to kill someone or bring someone to life, meaning like have a baby. Because then it's my choice. Mm-hmm. And you have to choose, for lack of a better term, you have to choose God over a darkness. And that's ultimately the final thing. But if I made everyone in my image, why would I cast other people into hell, whatever hell is, if hell exists? Mm-hmm. Why would I cast people for all eternity into the gnashing of teeth, hellfire? Mm-hmm. They were made in my image. They were the bad kids. You know, they were the dark shadows. We don't talk about them anymore. Yeah, I had 100 million kids, but there's 50 we just don't talk about. The other 50 can come to my table. Like, it doesn't make sense to me. So that sort of stuff is so, a lot of that is so man-made to me mm-hmm. that I can't wrap my head around it.
Mm-hmm. And very dualistic. Like, it's either this or it's this.
Right.
When it's like, my whole being at least feels like it's not this or this. It's a bunch of like in-between stuff.
Right. Yeah, and there's a lot of, I'm a vegan. I don't care what anyone else eats. Mm-hmm. I would never be that sort of person. Mm-hmm. But if you don't come to it yourself, if you're just standing in front of the church as a 13-year-old, pimply 13-year-old in a white robe, it's super hot out. It's the one day of the year that's packed more than Christmas and Easter because everyone brings their family to see young Scott become a man, young Scott become a Lutheran in this church that his grandparents helped build, his great-grandparents helped build the church.
Oh, my goodness. Okay.
So it's a big deal. The church is packed and it's boiling, and you say, yes, I believe in Christ as my only Savior. And then, wow, he said it, he believes it. Yeah. I don't think anyone else was going with that sham that I actually, but they do go a little bit with it like, oh, you're a good boy. Now you're a good boy. They don't realize you're going to move to the city, you're going to go to shitty bars, you're going to see cockroaches walking across the bar and hookers sitting next to you. It's like, this is the other part of the Bean videos. There's always that dark, alcoholic side to it. Mm-hmm. I was attracted, when I moved to the city, to the shittiest bars I could find, to the stories of old drunks. Mm-hmm. An old lady sat next to me and was talking to me. She had tons of like stage makeup on almost in this like faux fur coat at the shitty bar. All of a sudden I looked down at my drink, I looked back, she was gone, and the bouncer of the bar had her out on the sidewalk on her back. Came back and apologized to me like I was a regular at this establishment. This was not like a club. This was one of the shittiest bars I'd ever seen. And apologized to me and pointed to the stool where she, as she was rubbing my leg and talking to me about how fine of a man I was, she was peeing herself. She's done it before, and I've told her. If she does it again, she's out of here. But I loved all these stories. I loved going home at night, a little buzzed, falling asleep with these stories in my head as well.
Yeah.
It was as far from what my dad wanted me to be, maybe. But those people also deserve the attention of the church, of those people, you know?
Right.
And I also thought, my mom always said, why aren't you like this person who lost their son and got up in front of the church and talked about how God's love helped them? It's like, because I'm also interested in the person that's crippled by the loss of their son. Mm-hmm. I want to see that. Like, doubt is where faith begins to me. Mm. And I want to see the questioning of it. The unerring, hands in the air singing praise song stuff always makes me squirmishy. Mm-hmm. Because it just seems like I just want to get my hands dirty a bit and see the dark side as well. Mm-hmm.
You kind of want to be in the trenches with people and not just be with all the people who are like A-okay.
Right, and not just be with people that dress a certain way. We always had to dress up for church and don't have any doubts. And I don't want to just cast aside that whole other world that's out there, the underworld, you know?
Yeah.
Of the guys crouched over a bar drinking their pension money away. I'm fascinated by that.
But so that's interesting because it almost seems like a empathetic strength and curiosity like wrapped into each other, and then also storytelling. You're like interested in other people's stories. Did you go to school, by the way? Did you go to college?
I did Columbia College.
Oh, you did?
For video, for TV. Yeah. Yeah.
But where do you think this, because I have this theory that like children are the highlights of their parents, like the best, purest parts of their parents flood down into the children, and then it's up to the parent to recognize that and not view it as a weakness. Because I think if they view it as a weakness, it's something that they're actually being reflected in themselves, that they are like embarrassed that they never fostered it or never had the courage to act upon. But so then if they see that in their kid, they could view it as a weakness of the child or whatever. But I have this thought that like your curiosity, your love for storytelling and hearing stories, and then the empathy has to come from like the best parts of your parents.
My mother, almost completely, but my father as well, but my mother was amazingly empathetic. My mother could talk to anyone, and she wanted to hear about someone. But then she would carry it and worry about it. And she was a nervous person, generally speaking, but she loved to tell a story. My dad spoke not at all about his childhood. Anything I know about my dad's childhood was from my mom. He shut a door at some point. He had a rough childhood. And became a self-made man. But there was that thing where he had to shut that off and become something new.
I was wondering, do you still feel like you're uncoiling or working out or like feel like a child still? But like you're a husband and you're a father.
Yeah.
Like, are there parts of you that still feel
That's a great question.
Like a child?
Yeah. Sometimes. Because what happens in early death situations, when you have a great death early on and you don't have the proper grief therapy, which I definitely didn't, no one talked about it. No one seemed as upset as me.
About your grandfather?
About my grandfather, yeah. And we didn't really have a house that allowed you to wallow at all. Like, that's an understatement. Like, you feel bad, go to your room. Don't mope around here.
Yeah.
Yes. Was probably a lot of people's houses. To me, it was my house. You didn't get to wallow. You didn't get to pout. It's very much like move on. So what do you do when you lose the best friend you ever had? You felt the deepest love you had ever felt. That's gone, and you have no one to talk to about it. In retrospect, if I could build a time machine and go back to that, I would say, get the kids some counseling. Let them talk to someone that knows how to deal with this. Some Mr. Rogers type that can really, really help him unpack this live while it's happening. That is the opposite of what happened. I was just left alone to draw, to not wallow, to not think about it. And it was a mystery to me. I didn't get it. And then I started school. But where do you go with that? And none of your friends have that feeling. So you have this feeling, and it just gets shoved down deep into your subconscious. And then it comes out later as anxiety, as other things, as sadness, as this feeling of sort of aloneness or loneliness. It'll come out eventually. It doesn't go away. And it will affect you greater than had you dealt with it at the time. So it's an undercurrent that builds and will have to be released at some point. And when it comes back, it's kind of a monster sometimes, It's big and it's dark. So then you approach it as both a child and as an adult. And as a child, you don't have the sense or space in your brain to actually understand all the feelings of that. You haven't lived long enough to feel it. As an adult, you can slowly unpack it. And part of that being video thing, taking it on full on. My wife had heard the story told several times to her, and then she'd hear me telling the story to other people of my grandfather dying.
Yeah.
I showed her the video only when it was done. When it was out, released, I sat down with her and showed it to her, and she started bawling. And she said, I've heard the story, but I've never felt the pain of it until I saw this. And she knew there was a lot of pain with it, but to see it, and to see that little being alone again, or alone for the first time, putting on his grandpa's sweater, that got to her. It was a great thing to hear from her. Like I had communicated something I couldn't in words.
So I've watched the film just twice now. But I have to tell you, the first time I was watching it, I was just really watching it for the story of it. And I just was like, like trying to understand you as a person. Yeah. I was like, oh my gosh, no, and then I rewatched it again yesterday, just getting ready to talk with you. I was totally crying, Scott. But it wasn't until the end of it that I was really crying and for me, the posture is what was bringing me to tears. Just seeing like this little being looking for ways to still feel the presence of this person and trying to make the best decisions that this little guy can, and then ultimately going to, just holding the pipe and putting on the garments. Yeah. I was like, it's just such a human way of trying to get this person back.
Yeah, and it's those little things that people have, that sweater that he wore that smelled like him, that pipe that he smoked, that was such a part of him, the little knife that he had that had his initials in it that I had for a while and I lost. But like when someone dies, like when my dad died, it was like, oh, do you want this? Do you want that? There were things that were great and big, and you had this collection of coins. Like, can I get his passport? Like, that's cool to me. Like these little things. Or I still have his shaving kit. Like that's important to me. That's so intimate. It's like an intimate. And I open it once in a while, I'll look at it, but I'll never take anything out of it, really. I'll never use it to obviously I won't use it to shave, but it's kind of cool to look through it once in a while, like once every couple of years. But that's what I wanted. You take everything else. If he had a car or something, no, I don't want that. I want the shaving kit and the passport and his business card, Like that to me was who he was, and maybe a sweater, or something like that sort of stuff is kind of cool to me.
When he passed away, did you feel a sense of abandonment at that time?
No, I didn't. There was so much to do, and I was so worried about my mother because he did everything in the house. He cooked. She could cook a bit, but when he was working, she would make stuff once in a while. It wasn't great. He was a good cook.
Your father?
My father was a great cook.
Okay.
So, but he did all the finances and stuff. So we were all worried about how well she would get on. Like just all the instruments of living, and how do you control all the money and all that stuff, and make sure this is paid and all that stuff. And maybe also emotionally. They were married for a long time, and she really loved him. But she did great. She blossomed as a person without him. I didn't necessarily feel abandoned. I remember talking to my wife about it, and it kind of comes in waves. Yeah. Like you put it off for a while, but again, you're going to have to go through it at some point. So I didn't really feel much when he died because it was such a mixed relationship. I remember crying a lot more putting a cat down than when my dad died. Because the cat's an unconditional love. And maybe it scratched me once or twice, but my dad scratched me a lot. So it's a hard thing.
Yeah.
And I kind of felt like, when he would yell or when he would look at you as a kid, I thought, this guy wants to kill me. Like you really thought that. He was an intense dude. Never raised a hand. Never any of that. But he was like the prototype for me growing up as a man. So when someone like that dies, even though we had moved on, I'd become my own person, I felt like there was space, and I felt conflicted about what I felt about him. So as the years have gone on, I've missed him more and more, or missed that everything he did. He was a really great guy.
Yeah.
And he did some great things, and he showed me. I'm still unpacking things that he showed me that are influencing me, or like, wow, that was cool. I hated going on fishing trips with him. I would have to pack the car before he would get home because we would leave right away, and I would never do it right. He would complain that I'd eat my hamburger upside down when we'd stop for a hamburger. And he just seemed annoyed all the time, annoyed at me. So I felt like worthless, kind of. Like I can never live up to this guy.
Yeah.
But now looking back at it, And looking back at it through the eyes of my daughter, I see this fascinating, like, wow, he took me on this fishing trip to my uncle's in Wisconsin.
Right.
Like several times. And we'd go to these great places that have big Wisconsin pancakes, this great breakfast. Man, I would give anything to be there again. And know that he was just being an asshole because he was just tired and whatever else he was. Just frustrated, in general. But to have that time again would be great. But I've only come to that recently. He died in 97, years ago.
Yeah. I guess I was wondering if we ever stop feeling like children. I started thinking about this when we were just visiting Michael's grandparents who are in their 90s, and a lot of the conversation would go back to like who their parents were. And I'm like, these guys are in their 90s. Their parents have been dead for a long time.
Yeah.
They're children still.
Yeah. We're all the child of someone.
Yeah, and do we ever get to a point where we've worked the childlikeness or the child out of us in a way that we're like settled, like, okay, like you sound so settled, like understanding your dad a bit more, having like forgiveness towards your dad. And the other thing is like we're all the child of somebody, and then we're also the parent of, well, I'm not a parent yet, but like now you're the parent of somebody and you're expected to parent. Yes.
Getting it both ways. Yeah, and it's amazing. It's the greatest thing ever, and it's terrifying as shit.
Yeah.
And seeing everything and knowing how I reacted to my dad, and my wife knowing how she reacted to her mom, who was a very overbearing woman, like a huge lady, and kind of opera singery, like just loud, and had her own quirks. That's a whole nother 8-hour podcast. But we both go into this. One child gets all of that dumped on them. So when she's scared to go upstairs, I don't want to go upstairs, it's dark. My wife's like, just go up, we're right here. So I'll go up with you. Like she never has to go into a room where she's terrified to go into it without me.
Yeah.
For better or for worse. Right. I don't know if it's good or bad. I just know that that sucked. That won't suck for you. Like that's, it's like very concrete. If
there's any way to soften the blow of that for her, you're gonna try.
I'm gonna make it right for her. It wasn't right for me. I'm gonna make it right for you.
Right.
So any of that, and my mom died in 2013. My daughter was born in 2006. So my mom died around the same time as my grandpa died for me. So we did everything we could to let's draw her, let's talk about this. And I think it's going to reverberate for her, and it still does. She doesn't talk about it much, but I think it hurt. She didn't see her die, which is a whole nother level. To sneak down to a basement and see your dad, who you didn't get on well with, trying to revive your grandpa, who you loved more than anything you've ever loved in the world. That's a whole nother. That's like if you put that in a movie, people would say, it's a little too much, there's too many layers to this that are obvious, and but it happened. It was real, and it was huge, and it took 40 years to figure it all out, or get some sense of it, get a little bit of perspective on it. When my mom died, I remember thinking, oh shit, we just all moved up in line. Like if there was a grave site there, my dad dies, falls in the grave. My mom dies, there's no one left. So my sisters and I are the next in line. We're the next in line. We're standing at the edge of the grave. Whether that's 100 years or 10 years or 10 minutes. In order of family genealogy, if you draw the chart, we're the next to go if everything goes in natural order.
And is your plot already purchased? No, I'm just joking.
It isn't.
Okay.
My wife doesn't want to be put in the ground. I think I do, but I'm undecided. I should figure that out at some point and tell someone. But I do have, in dark Lutheran, death-obsessed ways, I do have a funeral playlist on my Spotify. 12 songs that I picked. It would be hell for people to sit there and just listen to songs, but in my mind, as I was picking them, I was thinking about that. Like, I'm up there in the casket and people are in this. I thought about it in the church. I don't think I'd be in the church. In Dundee. I haven't been to that church in years. But I see it in that church. I see things from my childhood still. When I imagine things now or in the future, as an imagination, I see them from a child's perspective.
Is your playlist called Funeral Playlist?
It used to be Triple X's.
Oh, okay.
But I couldn't get that to play on Alexa, like to say XXX, it wouldn't work. So now I think it's called I'm Not Here.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
now you know to look when I die.
Yeah. Yes,
Hey, he's
we'll
got
pass
this
this
playlist.
on,
Yeah,
people.
please. Now you know. Yeah. And I've thought about making a second one, like I'm over editing and overthinking it now. And for a while there, I was walking and moving. I'd have 6 songs. I'd play them. And I don't know about that song. Like I'd walk and think about it. I was training for this walk across Ireland that we did.
Yes.
So I was walking, for 6 hours a day and listening to these songs on repeat. The playlist was on repeat. Then I'd add, I for whatever reason, told myself 12 songs only. Maybe for time. So, when people sitting there for days listening to 100
You're
song
like
playlists.
so considerate.
But also, like, I wanted to edit myself. I wanted to put constraints on myself so that everything had a meaning and I didn't go overboard.
But so I'll ask this. This is the last question I'll ask, even though we can go on forever.
Yeah, we've got to give people a break.
Yeah, until round 2.
Right.
And this might be an asshole question to ask, but I don't know. It just kept coming back to me. What kinds of things?
Is this a segment on the podcast? The asshole question of the week?
Yeah. Well, I just felt like this is kind of too on the nose, but I don't know. I feel like you're flexible enough to go with me on it.
Yeah.
What kinds of things do you do these days to like make space for yourself so that you can just be Scott?
Yeah, that's a great question. Coming out of the summer rut, as they say. If I
Or
was
like
like some beast you studied, there'd be a term for it, like his molting period or something.
Oh, that's a good one.
He's molting. Don't bother him. He's molting. I mean, I used to, when I went to Ireland for the first time, I was living alone, and I had such bad relationships with women that I had kind of decided to be a bachelor and drink a lot and work a lot, and then just let that pan out the way it panned out, which would probably have been an early death. But I was alone all the time, and I liked being in a bar alone, and I liked being in a restaurant alone and just listening to other people and then going back to my own thoughts and just reading and then listening. The time for that is really rare now. But the few times I have it where I can just be by myself in a restaurant or at a bar, it's amazing because I'm a voyeur. So I would watch or listen to almost anything if I'm not really supposed to be watching or listening to it. Almost anything. And I find it all interesting. Like that thing I showed that picture of that lady who was at a Mexican restaurant in Indiana. I was sitting alone then, and she was talking about work endlessly. And the most boring thing ever is to hear someone talk about their work complaints when you don't know them and you don't know what they do. But I'm also, even though it's the most boring thing ever, and the most trivial sounding thing, but they're talking about it like it's their whole life. Like, who the fuck cares about your stupid job and this lady and not going to the copier when you asked her to? Who cares? But it's fascinating to me because it's dialogue, it's real life, and it means something to her. So that's recently where I found space. But the other place is drawing, which I haven't been doing much of lately, and I need to kick my ass into gear. I got to come out of the molting season. And I used to draw a ton with my daughter, and she still draws a lot. I just haven't been drawing, but I need to.
Yeah, it sounds like it's building up.
It's
like
coming to a head. It's
yeah.
definitely coming to a head. I get to that point where it's like, it's kind of like when you get a sliver and you get most of it out, but then the rest of your body works out and kind of pushes out. It's getting pushed out.
I was wondering if you could conclude this with just talking about Give a Shirt.
Oh, yeah.
So that people can understand what that is.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Did you start that?
I did start that.
Okay.
Yeah. So I have a T-shirt company. It's kind of T-shirts and posters and art, and that is Teetsy. So I was making T-shirts, and I've always had this thing in my head from my mom. My mom made me volunteer at a nursing home and the mental health center, which is totally like, wow, you get so much empathy from that. I love the volunteering at the nursing home. I love volunteering at the mental health center. So that giving back thing was always there. I was doing the Teetsy thing. I was making T-shirts. I saw a guy on the corner asking for money. And one day coming out of the Starbucks, he asked me for a lot of money. Like a lot more money. Not a lot of money. But he said, can you help me out a little more? I've got a job interview on Monday. And I got to get some good clothes, so I'm not going to get the job. I said, but I've got a T-shirt company, meaning I can get clothes wholesale. What size do you want? I can get you t-shirts. And I had gone to lunch, and on the way back, he said, okay, here's the sizes I need. And I'm thinking it should be a design like this. He had a business plan already for me to make him design t-shirts that he could sell to get money. So I made him 20 shirts, and he sold them all that day for $10 each, made $200 for himself.
Whoa.
So instead of shaking a cup, is what they call it in the homeless community, he was actually selling an item. And I kept thinking, how do I do that? And I kept talking to people about it. How do we make this bigger? And I like the idea of street art. And I like the idea of this stuff being out in the city. And how can we have this network of people doing this, and this network of people that are already on the street and already have people passing them by selling your art, and they can keep the cash. For years, for like 3 or 4 years, I carried this idea around. And then a lady called from our industry. She was doing an article on what people in the industry were doing for charity for the holidays. And I told her this idea. Boy, we're too busy, but I'd love to do this idea and make t-shirts and have homeless people sell them, and they could keep the money. She said, I've worked in charity for 20 years. That's an amazing idea. You should do it. I said, okay, you can print it. We're going to do it. And we had 3 weeks to plan for it. So I called a bunch of people in the industry that I knew liked to draw. Said, can you give me a t-shirt design? We printed shirts. So we were relying on that thought. Like, we get people from ad agencies to design the shirts. They'll tell their ad agency friends. We get a location where we can sell these things. A bunch of people will come. And it worked. We knew someone from the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, and he said, you've got to get Streetwise involved. They have the vendor network. Hadn't ever thought of that. Duh. It was like right in front of me. So we got Streetwise involved. They brought vendors to the pop-up shop, and 100% of everything we sold went straight to them. And we've done it for 3 years in a row. The first year, 7,000. The second year, 23,000.
Whoa.
And last year, 46,000.
Wow.
So it's grown in leaps and bounds. It can't continue to grow like that without us getting huge. And I'm still printing most of the shirts myself in my basement. And it's like 50 shirts per artist, and it's like 20 artists. And it's one color, but it's all hand-screened. The thing that I didn't realize, and I was exhausted that first year because we really, really put it all together really quickly. Everyone was exhausted. And I remember going home thinking, you know how you get into something thinking, this is why I'm doing this, and then you realize, oh, this is why I did this. Like something else was there that you were taught that had nothing to do with anything you ever thought before. That first year I realized we were doing it for the money, but we were also doing it to see people and to see these Streetwise vendors who were mostly homeless and to say, I'm here with you. I care about you. You're my neighbor, and I'm doing this for and with you.
Yeah.
And that meant more than handing them a check for $1,000 or $7,000 to Streetwise. My wife had come down to volunteer that first year, and this guy told her his whole life story. They were standing outside kind of barking to people that were walking by to get them to come in. She said, well, what are you doing this year? For like, what family do you have? She said, and he said, you're my family this year. Like, so that combined with some other things I heard people say, like they taught me a lot. And it's about dignity. Like if you stand on a street and ask people to buy a product, 150 people pass you before one person even says hello to you. And when they pass you, they don't just walk past you, they speed up and look the other way. That's got to eat at your soul.
Yeah.
So to see that, just a little bit we saw that. We still went home to homes. We still went home to a house that was warm, and we had food on the table, and we had jobs. But to stand there with them and see a little sliver of their world, it's like, shit. You could say there's reasons for it. You could, some of these people had drug addictions, whatever, but let's just give them a way to get out of that, is the point.
Well, thank you very, very much.
You're welcome. Is it still Friday? Did I miss my weekend?
Thank you to Scott for most graciously sharing his story and for being so kind and generous towards me as I stumbled through some of my questions. The song playing under this is called Love Song for Buddy by Headlights and is featured on Scott's film depicting the story of his grandfather Rudy's death. If you'd like to see Scott's films and Scott's artwork, go to teetsy.com. That's TEETSY.com. Also, if you'd like to donate to Give a Shirt by getting a shirt, go to giveashirt.net. I highly recommend going to the site and perusing through the inventory, especially if you're still doing your holiday shopping. There are so many cool designs. This year's theme is Love is a Battle, but also there's tons of Give a Shirt swag, hoodies, mugs, tanks, hats, and visors, and all profits go to Streetwise. That is to say, every single cent that you give goes directly to Streetwise. As always, the links to all of these are below in this episode's description, which you can find wherever you're currently listening to this episode. I've also included a link to Scott's funeral playlist titled I'm Not Here, which you can find on Spotify. Lastly, I asked Scott whether or not he wished someone had told him ahead of time that his grandpa was going to die. And he said no, that he had just wished someone had processed with him through the grief. I also asked him if he ever talks to his grandpa, and he said no. He just thinks of him often. I'm not sure if I'm going to be putting out another episode before the end of this 2018. If I don't, happy holidays to each of you. If I was right next to you right now, I would hug you, but I'm not. So I'll just say, hug the ones that you love and let them hug you back. This episode of Mostly Minutia was recorded on location in Chicago, Illinois.